Hey everybody, welcome to This Week Friday in the Parables. This week I decided to call an audible and change what we were talking about, mainly because Luke 15, the chapter before Luke 16, is sort of the beginning point of a series of parables that sort of helps us keep in mind what all these next few parables are sort of talking about. And so we want to look tonight at the parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the lost coin, which is found in Luke chapter 15, verses 3 through 10. As always, we look at the background, the text, and the application. And these two parables that we're looking at tonight are also going to tie in well with the parable next week, which will be the parable of the prodigal son. But looking at Luke chapter 15, one of the things that we want to talk about in terms of the background is the fact that this parable is really in the midst of Jesus talking about a lot of things that began back in chapter 14 and verse 1. In fact, when you go back to Luke 14, you see that there was a certain day, it was a Sabbath day, where Jesus was invited to eat into the house of one of the Pharisees, a ruler of the Pharisees. And this is where all of this has happened. He heals a man with dropsy. He's taught about several things. He gave a parable about the Great Supper in Luke 14:15. And as this is going on, there's a lot of people that begin to come to the house of this Pharisee because they've heard Jesus here. And in Luke 14:25, you see that there are great multitudes that came to him. And he begins to talk to them in verses 25 through 35. Well, as Jesus is talking to this group of people that have come to this Pharisee's house, the Pharisees decide to murmur against Jesus about what he's doing. And this is actually not odd that a lot of people have gathered. Again, houses are pretty open back in that time. And so the way that it would work is that sometimes if you ever invited somebody over to eat, if this is a well-known person, sometimes you would have people that would gather around the house and maybe even gather outside where they're eating, because houses were sort of more open then than they were today. And so this is really not all that unique for this to happen. But the point being here is that beginning in chapter 15, again, then drew near unto him all the publicans and sinners for to hear him. And the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, This man receiveth sinners and eateth with them. And so this is really where the background of the next three parables really tie in here. Jesus is going to contrast the mindset of the Pharisees and the scribes compared to what is his mindset, and obviously what God the Father's mindset is as well. And so he gives two parables. He gives three parables in all of this. We're looking at the first two tonight, the parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the lost coin. So he begins by saying, verse 3, He spake this parable unto them, saying, What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he lose one of them, doth not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after that which is lost until he finds it? So in verse 4, you've got a man that is essentially pretty well off. If you had 100 sheep, you're not going to be a person who's struggling in life per se. I believe when Jacob met with Esau, after, if you remember in the book of Genesis, Jacob was afraid to meet with Esau because of Jacob taking Esau's birthright. And one of the gifts that Jacob gave to Esau was somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 220 sheep. And Jacob was a fairly wealthy man, and so this is a man that's pretty well off. The thing about shepherding is that the Pharisees apparently sort of looked down on shepherds. In fact, you can go back and look at some of their text, or at least some of the texts that came in the couple centuries after from some Jewish leaders that in many cases liken shepherding to that of a thief. And it might have been the case where sometimes shepherds were maybe known for stealing some of the flock of other shepherds, but shepherding was looked down upon. The Pharisees would have looked down upon the idea of shepherding as something that was unclean or something that was beneath them. And so it's kind of interesting in verse 4, Jesus is saying here, what man of you having 100 sheep? Well, the Pharisees and scribes would not have thought about putting themselves in this position And likewise, it kind of drives the point home even more that the Pharisees themselves, while they look down on this position, what they thought of themselves to do in terms of being the teachers of the law, they're really failing in that as well. But again, you see verse 4 that one sheep is lost or has gone away from the 99. And there's some people that want to emphasize that the shepherd's being negligent here because he's not keeping up with the 99. And likewise, in the later parable, in verse 8, the woman who, some suggest the woman's negligent of the 9 pieces of silver that she has and has not lost. That's not really what the focus is here. The focus is again all on that one sheep and on that one coin that is lost. And so he goes and he does everything that he can to find it. In verse 5, when he finds it, it says that he layeth it on his shoulders rejoicing. Sometimes shepherds might have done this to obviously keep a sheep from wandering off again because you control them. But again, the idea of putting a sheep around a person's shoulders is the idea of carrying the sheep, not making it walk. If you remember a few weeks ago when we talked about the catacombs in which sometimes Christians buried their dead in the 2nd century, one of the most notable artwork in some of those catacombs was a picture of a man carrying a sheep with its legs that's sticking over his shoulders and the sheep around his neck. And that was just the sign of a shepherd that cared about his sheep. And that's what the idea is here. He finds the sheep, verse 6 and 7. He cometh home, he calleth together his friends and neighbors, saying unto them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. I say unto you that likewise joy shall be in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, more than over 99 just persons which need no repentance. And so, again, the point here that Jesus is trying to get at is that the Pharisees essentially have no concern about those that are lost. And if you think about it in the sense of this parable, they have no concern about the one lost sheep. They're more concerned about themselves, who they would often think of themselves probably as the 99, those that are not lost. But in contrast, Jesus shows compassion towards those that are lost, as evident by chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Jesus had compassion. He was concerned about the publicans and the sinners that had gathered together. The Pharisees were not concerned at all. And so Jesus and God, and what we should emulate is, again, the same type of mindset, the one who's willing to go after and find that one lost sheep. So verses 8 and 10, the parable of the lost coin, again, a similar point. Right, verse 8, Either what woman having 10 pieces of silver, if she lose one piece, doth not light a candle and sweep the house and seek diligently till she find it? And when she had found it, she calleth her neighbors and her neighbors together, saying, her friends and her neighbors together, saying, Rejoice with me, for I have found the piece which I had lost. Likewise I say unto you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one that repenteth. So again, one piece of silver would have been about the equivalent of a day's wage. So it's not like she's lost a quarter or a dime, something that's relatively insignificant. It would be about the same thing as losing a day's worth of pay, which again is, depending on where your standing is in life, that could be a considerable amount of money. You note in verse 8 that she lights a candle to sweep the house. Generally, houses at this time didn't have a lot of windows, so you had to have artificial light, in the form of lighting a candle or something like that to sweep. And sometimes the way that houses were built, and I was reading what one writer was saying about this, that sometimes you had cracks in the floors of the home, and so it wouldn't be uncommon for a coin to slip into the crack and get it underneath the house. And some archaeologists have even discovered coins that were found in the cracks that were below homes. But the point again being here is that the woman could have simply said, well, I've still got 9 pieces of silver, that's good enough. But she doesn't have that mindset. She wants to find the other piece of silver that has left because it means something to her. And in both of these accounts, you see where the person who has found that which is lost rejoices over that fact and wants other people to rejoice in that. And what you could really kind of see here is sort of an indirect, maybe not so much a sharp criticism of the Pharisees. Jesus is not the only one who should be excited about the Pharisees and the publicans and the sinners being here, but the Pharisees and the scribes who, again, they think of themselves as teachers and practicers of the law of Moses. Jesus is emphasizing that they also should have the same means of rejoicing, because they are right there witnessing those that are lost coming to Jesus to find salvation. But again, the Pharisees and the scribes, they have not emulated that. And this again will become a lot more direct in next week's parable and in the parables following. So when you think about this application, again, we have to emulate the same type of mindset that God and Jesus have when it comes to finding the lost. And you can think about Luke 15 being very similar to Luke chapter 19, in which Jesus meets Zacchaeus. And as Zacchaeus is talking with Jesus, there are some in the crowd around Jesus that murmur about the fact that Jesus is talking to a tax collector and is planning to go and eat in his home. And Jesus just simply responded to that idea in Luke chapter 19 by saying to those people, "This day has salvation come to this house, for as much as he also is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which was lost." Because according to Jesus, it's not that he wasn't unconcerned about those that maybe thought of themselves as better than others. Obviously, he was concerned about them. But whereas a lot of religious leaders would not have been concerned with Zacchaeus, Jesus is making the point that if you want to be my follower, you have to have the same level of desire to seek out and to bring to salvation a man like Zacchaeus, who was looked down upon in society. I know we talked about this last week, or a few weeks ago, with the example of the Apostle Paul, right? And how when Paul went to Athens, he's dealing with people that really he doesn't have a whole lot of common background with them. And a lot of people would say, they don't really fit in my flock, so to speak, right? They're not like us. And so there are a lot of people that would say that, they wouldn't spend any time trying to work on converting and teaching them, because they're not like them. But Paul, again, didn't have that mindset. He tried to find common ground because he wanted to seek after any sheep, even if they weren't like him himself, right? And if they came from a different background. Paul really emulated that mindset very well. We also keep in mind, again, what is our position in relation to, where we are with Jesus, who is the chief shepherd, right? Because, we can sort of marginalize those sheep that have wandered off and not think very much about them when we are either in the 99 or we are one of the 9 pieces of silver, where we are not in a state where we are lost. And it can be very easy for us to sort of overlook those that have gone astray because we're more focused on, being excited that we're in the 99 or we're part of the 9 pieces of silver. But the fact of the matter is, we never know what can happen in life that may cause us to leave being one of those that is in the safety of being in the shepherd's fold, or in the safety of being in those 9 pieces of silver. We can easily become lost ourselves. And if we don't have a proper mindset about seeking after others who are lost, why should someone who is in the fold have the mindset to seek after us if we become lost? Because in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1, Paul's very direct about this. "Brethren, if a man be overtaken in fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted." So part of what Paul is getting at there is, you go and you try to help those that have fallen into sin, and you do it in a humble fashion. But part of what's being emphasized there too is that, you could very well be in the same position later on, in the spirit of meekness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Because it can be very easy for us to, if we've been faithful all of our lives, it could be very much a possibility that we could wind up becoming lost at some point. And we should want people to have the desire to seek after us. So really the golden rule, Matthew 7:12, "Whatsoever that men should do unto you, do ye even also to them," is really emphasized there. And that's sort of looking again at the parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the lost coin. Again, the desire to find those that are lost. And that becomes a lot clearer too with the parable that we'll talk about in Luke chapter 15 with the parable of the prodigal son. Well, that being said, we'll go ahead and stop here for tonight. Again, thank you for your time, thank you for your attention, and I hope to be able to see you all on